So you sent this Fox News piece over, and it's about some really interesting interactions at former President Carter's funeral.
Yeah.
Trump chats up Obama, while Clinton's Harris ignored President-elect at Jimmy Carter funeral. Sounds like there's some serious political theater for us to unpack here.
Funerals like this, especially for someone like Carter, they often become a stage where all these subtle political undercurrents kind of come up to the surface.
It's like a real-life political drama unfolding right before our eyes. Our source, this Fox News article from January 9th, 2025, it lays out who talked to whom, and even more interestingly, who seemed to avoid whom.
Exactly. And even those choices, like even the non-interactions, can say a lot about what's going on in politics right now.
Okay, so let's set the scene first. The funeral was held at the Washington National Cathedral in D.C. on January 9th. Obviously a somber occasion, and all the former presidents and vice presidents, along with their families, were seated in the second row.
That seating arrangement is key.
Yeah.
You rarely see so many political heavy hitters all together like that.
Right.
It's a unique opportunity to observe and, let's be honest, speculate a bit.
Right. And one of the biggest things the article highlights is President-elect Trump. He was there with Melania, ending up seated next to former President Obama.
Oh, wow.
They were even described as chatting and chuckling as people filed in.
Wow.
Given their history, that's pretty surprising, right?
It is interesting. You have to remember, these two have had a very public and often contentious rivalry.
Yeah.
Both during the 2016 and 2024 elections.
Their interactions were legendary. From those fiery debates to the constant back and forth on social media. So to see them looking friendly at a funeral is quite the turn of events.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if this is a genuine attempt at reconciliation. You know, maybe they're acknowledging how serious the occasion is.
Right.
Or if there's something more strategic going on.
Because, let's face it, politicians are always thinking about how people will see their actions.
Of course.
Especially in front of a crowd like this.
Precisely. And this leads us to another interesting thing the article mentions. Trump usually wears those red power ties.
Right, it's a signature look.
Yeah. But he decided to go with a more low-key dark suit and blue tie for the funeral. And Obama showed up without Michelle.
Those details seem small, but they could actually be important. Could they be subtle ways of managing their image given their past rivalry? It's almost like they're trying to look united even if it's just for the cameras.
That's a possibility. Or maybe it's just because of the serious nature of the event.
Yeah.
A way of saying this day is about honoring President Carter, not personal or political differences.
But it's hard to completely separate those things,
right.
Especially in Washington politics.
Right. While Trump and Obama are having their little chat, let's not forget the other big names who were there. For example, Al Gore. He was there alone since he and Tipper split in 2010. He was the first one to stand up and greet Trump when he arrived.
Now that's interesting, Gore. A top Democrat reaching out to the incoming Republican president-elect. It doesn't really fit the idea of a totally divided political scene, does it?
It does make you think it could just be a sign of respect putting politics aside to mourn a president.
Yeah.
Or it could mean something more strategic, like maybe he's showing that he's open to talking and maybe even working together in the future.
Which makes me wonder about Gore's old running mate, Bill Clinton. Did he do the same for Trump?
Well, their article specifically says that the Clintons, both Bill and Hillary, pretty much ignored Trump when they got there.
Okay, so now we're seeing some of that avoidance you talked about. What do you think about that? Is it just personal dislike, or could it be a political move?
It's probably both. The Clintons and Trump have a long and messy history.
Yeah.
Full of public fights and personal attacks.
Mm.
Them ignoring Trump could just be them continuing that bad blood.
Right.
Refusing to talk to someone they see as an enemy in politics.
But it could also be a way of showing they're against Trump and his ideas.
Drawing a line in the sand, especially for their supporters.
So it's not just about how they feel, it's about sending a message to their political base. And speaking of political allies, let's not forget about former Vice President Mike Pence. Did he interact with his old boss at all?
According to the article, Pence did talk to Trump for a bit, but Karen Pence stayed seated and didn't say anything.
Okay.
People even think they can read Pence's lips and that he said, "Good to see you."
Wow, that's a loaded statement considering their big falling out after January 6, 2021. Remember, Pence stood up to Trump by refusing to overturn the election results.
Right.
That basically ended their political partnership and caused a huge split in the Republican Party.
Absolutely. That event really messed up their relationship. So even a simple "good to see you" means something totally different now.
It makes you wonder what's really going on. Are they even close to making up, or is the damage too big to fix? It's like, we need a body language expert to understand these interactions.
While I'm not an expert in nonverbal communication, we can say that Pence talking to Trump is very different from the Clintons avoiding him. It suggests they might be at least a little bit civil, even if they don't become friends again.
But there's another important person who wasn't there. The article says Dick Cheney and Lynn Cheney didn't come. Considering the very public fights between Trump and the former VP, their absence says a lot.
It does. It reminds us that some political fights are so bad that even a funeral can't fix them. It seems some bridges are burned for good.
Okay, so we've got some clear signs of tension and people avoiding each other. But the article also talks about one person who seemed to get a warm welcome from almost everyone.
You're talking about George W. Bush, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It seems like he gained the most greetings out of all the living presidents who were there. The Pences, the Gores, and even the Quayles all went to say hi to him.
It's interesting that this was happening while Obama and Trump were still talking, seemingly not noticing the Bush love fest going on around them. Maybe they chose not to go over there for their own reasons, or maybe they were really into their conversation.
It's hard to know for sure, but them not participating makes this whole thing even more complicated.
It does. Bush is often seen as more of a middle ground guy, and it looks like he's bridging the gap between the Obama and Trump groups, at least here. But it makes you wonder, is this real friendship, or is there some political strategy behind this warm welcome? Is he trying to make himself look like a unifier in a political world that's so divided?
That's a great question. And it shows that even at a funeral, those political undercurrents are always there. But let's go back to the people avoiding Trump. The article says the next big arrival was Kamala Harris with Doug Emhoff.
And as you might guess, the article points out that Trump didn't acknowledge Harris, and she didn't acknowledge him. This trend of people avoiding Trump is becoming pretty important.
It is, and it gets even more interesting because the article says Harris looked back at Obama and Trump who were still talking, and she seemed to grimace.
Now, a grimace can mean different things. It's hard to know what Harris was thinking at that moment. Was she showing that she disapproved of them talking, or was it just because of the sad event?
Or maybe it was just a quick expression caught out of context and made into a big deal by the media.
That's possible. But the fact that the article decided to point out this detail makes it seem like it might be more than just a coincidence. It adds to this idea that there's a clear division between those who are okay with Trump and those who aren't.
And that division, it seems, even includes the current administration. The article says that when President Biden and Jill Biden arrived, neither Trump nor Obama greeted them.
That's right. And even more surprising is that none of the other families greeted the Bidens either. The article describes Jill helping the president get seated, and Biden seeming to clean his trousers and brow, and then things just went back to normal. No warm welcomes, no handshakes, nothing.
That's a pretty cold reception, especially from your own party. You'd think there'd be at least a little nod, even if it was just to be polite. It really shows how tense and awkward things seem to be at this event.
It does. And it brings up some big questions. Is this cold shoulder intentional? A sign of the huge political divides that are still bothering the country, even at a funeral? Or is it just protocol, a way of showing respect for the serious nature of the occasion?
It's hard to know for sure, but it's definitely something worth thinking about more. And speaking of interesting observations, the article mentions something kind of weird about outgoing Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau.
Oh yeah, the Trudeau thing. What's that about?
Well, people are sharing screenshots on X that show Trudeau watching Trump very closely as he walked into the cathedral.
Interesting. Is Trudeau just curious, taking in the spectacle of American politics? Or does him watching suggest something more? Does it hint that other countries are really interested in what's happening in U.S. politics?
That's a great question, and it leads us perfectly into our next segment.
Yeah, it seems like we've just started to explore this political puzzle.
Yeah.
And there's a lot more to discuss and analyze. It seems like even a serious event like President Carter's funeral can't escape American politics. We've got all these interesting interactions, or actually the lack of them, that you've pointed out from that Fox News article.
Right.
And it feels like we're watching some kind of political chess game happening in real life.
It does. It's like everyone is thinking hard about their next move.
Exactly.
Trying to get in the best position for this new and uncertain political situation.
Exactly. And you mentioned Trudeau watching Trump come in.
Right.
That's a perfect example. It reminds us that the whole world is watching how this power struggle plays out in the U.S.
Yeah.
American politics, especially right now, affects everyone. And these little interactions can have big consequences, even outside of D.C.
It's like every handshake, every time someone looks away, every carefully chosen word,
Right.
It's all being examined and analyzed for some hidden meaning.
Exactly. And it's not just about how it looks. It's about understanding why these important players are doing what they're doing.
Right.
Take, for example, the way President Biden was seemingly ignored.
Yeah, you're right. It's not often you see a sitting president basically ignored by his own party, especially at an event like this. What do you think about that? Is it just about respecting the serious nature of the event, or is there something more to it?
It's definitely unusual. One explanation could be that it shows the tricky balance of power in the Democratic Party.
Okay.
Remember, some people saw Biden's win in 2024 as a rejection of the more progressive part of the party, the people like Harris.
So could this lack of interaction be because some people are still upset, or even a way to try to weaken Biden's power within his own party?
It's possible. Or it could be that at this particular event, they wanted to shift the focus away from the current administration to show respect for President Carter's legacy.
Okay.
It's important to remember that funerals are about honoring the past,
Right.
not about current or future political battles.
That's a good point. But even knowing that, it's still pretty noticeable, and it speaks to the bigger idea that we're seeing changes in alliances and power dynamics in American politics.
Absolutely. And maybe the most dramatic example of this change is how Trump and Obama seem to be getting along. These two have been fighting for years, but here they are, chatting and chuckling, as the article says. What do you think is going on there?
To be honest, it's confusing. They've insulted each other, questioned each other's policies, and represented completely different visions for the country. To see them put their differences aside even for a little while is really strange.
It is. But remember, both Trump and Obama are very smart politicians. They understand the power of how things look.
Right.
How important it is to present a certain image.
So could this be a planned move for both of them? A way to look presidential and, above all, the political fighting, especially at a time of national mourning?
That's definitely possible. But it's also worth thinking about maybe there's a more practical reason for this.
What do you mean?
Well, both Trump and Obama have been known to be practical. They're both willing to work with people they don't agree with if it helps them. And in this situation, it helps both of them to look united and put their personal issues aside.
So everyone wins. They get to look like they're working together, maybe reduce some of the political tension and avoid any bad press that might come from seeming divided at a funeral?
Exactly. It's a strategic move that goes beyond their personal dislike for each other.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about the other people who seem to avoid Trump on purpose, like the Clintons and Harris, for example? What's their plan?
Them avoiding Trump could be seen as a calculated political move.
Okay.
A way of showing they're against him and his policies while also making their own base stronger.
So they're basically saying, we're not with you and we're not afraid to show it.
Exactly. It's a way of separating themselves from Trump, both in terms of ideas and politics.
But isn't that a risky strategy considering Trump is back in the White House? Wouldn't it be smarter to try to have some kind of working relationship with him, even if it's just for show?
Maybe. But some politicians might think that upsetting their main supporters by being too friendly with Trump is a bigger risk than the possible benefits of working together.
So it's a tough choice. They have to think about the pros and cons of dealing with Trump, knowing that everything they do will be watched and analyzed by both their supporters and their opponents.
Exactly. And it's not just about managing their own image. It's also about shaping the story, influencing public opinion, and maybe even swaying voters in future elections.
Speaking of influencing voters, let's go back to Mike Pence for a second. Him talking to Trump, even if it was just a quick hello, seems important because of their crazy history.
Doesn't it? Remember, Pence stood up to Trump on January 6th, 2021,
Right.
by refusing to overturn the election results. That act basically ended their political partnership and split the Republican Party.
It was a huge moment for sure, and it made people wonder about Pence's political future. Some people saw him as a traitor, while others thought he was a hero. So to see him even acknowledge Trump at the funeral is pretty surprising.
It is, but it also might mean that their relationship is changing a little bit.
Okay.
Maybe things are starting to get better between them.
Do you think they could actually become friends again? Or is this just a temporary thing for show?
It's hard to say for sure. It's important to remember that both Trump and Pence want to do well in politics.
Right.
Trump, even though he lost in 2020, still has a lot of support in the Republican Party.
And Pence, even though he had that falling out with Trump, is seen by many as a possible candidate for the 2028 Republican nomination.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So them talking at the funeral could be a sign of a strategic alliance.
Okay.
They might realize that they need each other to reach their political goals.
It's almost like a game of political chess where each player is thinking carefully about their next move.
Right.
Trying to guess what their opponent will do and ultimately trying to win.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And in this game, there are no real allies, just temporary teams formed because it's necessary or convenient.
Okay, so we've talked about the Trump-Obama thing, the Clintons and Harris avoiding the Pence-Trump exchange, and Justin Trudeau watching from the sidelines. It seems like every interaction or lack of interaction at this funeral has some political meaning.
It does. And it reminds us that even in the most ordinary moments, those political forces are always there, shaping the story, influencing decisions, and ultimately deciding what happens.
So as we move on, what are the main things we've learned from this deep dive? What should we be paying attention to as we try to understand this always changing political world?
I think the biggest takeaway is that the political world is more divided than ever.
Okay.
The traditional party lines are blurry, and we're seeing new groups and alliances forming that don't fit into the usual categories.
Like the split we're seeing in both the Democratic and Republican parties.
Exactly. And this division is probably going to have a big effect on everything from policy debates to how people campaign in elections.
So we need to pay close attention to how these groups change, how they interact with each other, and how they use their power to influence the political agenda.
Exactly. We also need to be aware of how individual personalities play a role. As we saw at the funeral, personal relationships, grudges, and ambitions can have a big impact on political decisions.
It's not just about policy, it's about the people behind the policy. And understanding those personal dynamics can often be more important than any political platform or ideology.
Absolutely. And finally, I think it's important to remember that the political world is always changing. What's important today might not matter tomorrow.
So we need to stay informed, be flexible, and be ready for anything.
Well said. In a world where there's so much information and things change so fast, being able to adapt and think critically are essential skills for understanding the complicated world of politics.
It seems like even a sad event like a funeral can show us what the bigger political world is like.
Yeah, it proves that politics are always there, even when people are reflecting and the nation is mourning.
Right.
These gatherings of politicians, no matter the reason, they always become chances to observe, analyze, and, speculate a little.
We've seen hints of alliances tension just below the surface and power dynamics subtly shifting. It really does feel like we got a peek behind the curtain in D.C.
And that peek, I think, shows a political scene that's more divided and unpredictable than ever. We've talked about the splits in both the Democratic and Republican parties, but this funeral also showed how important individual personalities are and how they affect the political stage.
Right, like the friendly chat between Trump and Obama, even though they've been rivals for so long.
Yeah.
Or the Clintons and Harris seeming to go out of their way to not talk to the former president at all.
These choices people make, whether they're thinking about it or not, add to the bigger story and affect how people see these figures in their political plans.
It's like a giant puzzle, and each of these interactions or lack of interactions is a piece that helps us see the whole picture. But like we talked about, that picture is always changing, isn't it?
Absolutely. The political world is dynamic and fluid, always moving. What seems important today might not matter at all tomorrow.
So how do we understand it all? What are the main things we've learned from this deep dive that can help us figure out this always changing political world?
I think the most important thing is to be able to adapt. We have to be willing to change our understanding of politics as new information comes up and as these players make their moves.
So we can't hold on to old ideas or strict ideologies anymore.
Exactly. We also need to be aware of how powerful perception is. Like we saw at this funeral, every interaction, every gesture, every word can be interpreted in different ways and can be used to shape the story.
It's like a constant PR battle where everyone is trying to control the message and influence what the public thinks.
Exactly. And in this battle, the people who can adapt, who can see what's coming next, and who can communicate their message well, will have a big advantage.
So what does all this mean for the future of American politics?
I think we're going into a time of a lot of uncertainty. The old rules don't work anymore. The traditional alliances are falling apart and new power centers are coming up.
It's like we're watching a political realignment happening right now.
It is, and it's going to be really interesting to see how it all turns out. Who will come out on top? Who will make new alliances? And what will the new political world look like?
Those are questions we can't answer for sure today, but we can stay informed, have thoughtful conversations, and be ready for the unexpected.
Well said. And maybe as we move forward, we can all learn something from what happened at President Carter's funeral. Even in times of sadness and reflection, the political game keeps going, and those who pay attention, who analyze the subtle cues and shifting dynamics, will be better prepared to understand this complex and ever-changing world.
So to our listeners, keep your eyes open and your mind engaged. The political drama is far from over, and as we've seen, even the smallest interactions can tell us a lot about where our nation is and the forces shaping our future.